After d4, d5, c4, knight c6, our beloved Chigorin Defence is on the board. So in this video, I'm going to cover the e3 line. Now the move is e5, so pretty thematic. In the previous videos, I've been doing mostly the 4 knights, and then I'm going to be covering the main line because there's so much to talk about in the main line in the next videos to come in the following days. Right now I'm going through this very popular one, right? So e3, basically, next move is white is playing e3, developing the bishop in c4 in case we take. Well, we're not going to take just a typical move for Queen's Gambit players. They're going to play knight f3 eventually. Well, we're going to have to ask them a question already. So e5 comes now with an attack on the pawn, and now I'm going to go through what happens after pawn takes e5, which is first of all, it's the main move. Secondly, other moves will just create transpositions into other lines that we have already seen and also that we will see in the future. So I'm not going to go through them. I'm going to go through the main line, which is this one, d takes e5. So what to do now? Black has lost the pawn, and so of course we don't take back because that will allow white to take our queen and reduce our development, and it gives better chances to white. Now the move is d4. So we gave up the pawn and we're willing to give up another. Now there's plenty of options. I'm going to go through all of them. The main option here for white is to take, so that white has a pawn advantage, right? So now white's got 2 pawns advantage, but we're going to take immediate. Queen takes d4. So black is down a pawn, but development of the black player is better. So black's got 2 pieces developed. It's not convenient for white to take our queen because then we take back with the knight, and then we really are already threatening stuff. Anyway, after queen d4, let's just look at very quickly at all the things that can go wrong. So after bishop to d3, for example, white wants to maybe speed up development, knight f3 and maybe castle. Well, this is immediately punished. Bishop b4 check. White cannot block with the bishop because then queen takes bishop in d3. White cannot block with the knight in d2 for the same reason. White cannot block with the knight in c3 because of bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes with check, and we either take the bishop in d3 or the rook. Well, okay, so what's the move here? Of course, the move is king f1. There's really no other move that makes sense. And now black takes the pawn. There's a double attack on the bishop, so white is in huge trouble already. And guess what? There's no other way to defend this bishop with another piece, so the bishop will have to move. Let's just quickly mention king e2 looks just completely horrible. In fact, king e2 is met by bishop g4, the game is over. If white blocks with a knight, knight f3, rook d8, there's three attackers on this bishop. It's game over. There's no other way to defend this bishop, so black will win a piece and quickly the game. If white were to block the check the check from the bishop with f3, then we will castle alongside, and again we have 3 attackers here. Yes, we are giving up the bishop, but after pawn takes bishop and knight takes, and here we have all sorts of discovered checks, and well, we'll be winning the queen very soon. So here we are again. After bishop d3, we need to do check. That's check, and after king f1, we take the pawn and we double attack the bishop. Okay, let's just quickly mention bishop to c2, the bishop defends the queen, then this comes with a check, queen to c4 check. Let's just have a look at this position. I mean, the white player is not going to be able to castle. Black's got 3 pieces developed, all of them in central squares, aiming at the direction of the king, and black will not take long to play rook to d8, for example, attacking the queen, and white has got very limited moves available. So after a move like queen e2, white might be willing to swap pieces, of course, in order to reduce the initiative of the opponent. Black plays bishop e6. This is an excellent and very principled move, right? So we're not moving the queen around, we're not swapping, we're simply developing more pieces, and if they take us, we can take back. So after bishop e6, the idea of playing long castle, knight f6 straight after. Let's say white develops a piece, so knight to f3. This is terrible because of queen takes, king takes, and now bishop c4 check. We've got 2 bishops that looks like knives, and after king to d1, black's development is complete with a check, and now white will have to block this. Well, whatever white does to block, it's just going to get passive because he's going to undevelop his own pieces, and he's going to have to pin his own pieces. So let's say after bishop d2, at least white will want to develop a piece, maybe not knight to d2 because it blocks the bishop, so it's kind of, well, it doesn't really matter too much after a move like bishop d2, just to make an example. I mean, these are sidelines. It's important to know how to go on, but there's just billions of different variations, so of course we're not going to be able to go through all of them. We're going to have to just look at the ideas. Now the idea is knight takes f3. This is typical. We're creating a double isolated pawn. In this kind of Queen's Gambit game, where white traded the d pawn for the e pawn, and then eventually we went on with d4, of course we have created a weakness because the opponent has been moving the pawns too many times. So after this move, Now black plays bishop to c5 and starts and attacks this weak pawn, which by the way cannot be defended. So let's just go on a few moves like knight to c3 and bishop to f2. The opponent is not going to be able to castle ever, and this rook is not going to be able to be activated anywhere. And besides, after taking the f2 pawn, we're not just going for a pawn, we're also going for this e3 square, and we're just going to be creating an attack on this bishop that is too strong and cannot be defended. Let's say white plays pawn to b3 attacking our bishop, we can just leave it there, play bishop e3 and threaten to make a check with the rook and then potentially win the bishop if the king moves to e1, or give a discover check if the king moves to c1. Not very important. Right, here we are again. After bishop e4 check, f1, knight e5, double attack on the bishop, bishop to c2, queen to c4 check. What happens if white blocks with the knight and say maybe I can play a move like g3 eventually, king somewhere, and then maybe develops the rook. I don't know where exactly because the bishop is there. But after knight to e2, now black continues the development. This is all very harmonious. A typical Chigorin development, right? No time for pawns moves, just develop the pieces, get ready to get the rook into the game and punish white for moving too many pawns. Bishop g4 now, pinning the knight, putting more and more pressure on the e2 square. What can white do right now? Well, lots of things. Black would love to play a move like rook d8 right now, for instance. White may try something like bishop to d2, maybe in order to play queen to d1, maybe start swapping pieces, get some relief, starts breathing a little bit, save the queen from the potential attack of the rook in d8. So after a move like d2, black goes on with castling for the sake of development. The idea is to play knight f6 as soon as possible. And now black is threatening stuff. Like for example, bishop takes knight with check, queen takes back, then we can take this bishop. So you see the pressure that black is applying on white's pieces is tremendous. Even after a move like knight to c3, maybe white wants to protect the knight a little bit further, then bishop can still take the knight. Bishop takes, knight takes, and now there's double attack here. Let's look at a move like f3, for example. White is just thinking, you know what, let's just try to breathe a little bit and release the pressure. After this move, the development of the black play is so harmonious. Black can even sacrifice the knight, and here's basically there's a tactic. Well, after pawn takes knight, then now black is taking the pawn, and there's an attack on the rook will have to move, and then rook e8. There's just too much stuff happening here. There's no point to continue. Right, back in the starting position after bishop e4 check and king f1, knight e5. What happens after bishop goes back to e2? Prevent, well, not losing this pawn at least. Well, then very simple. The queen takes the queen, and then only move bishop takes back. And now bishop e6, there's double attack on this pawn, there's an idea of taking the pawn and start spinning stuff and then castle and so on. So the ideas are always the same, right? There's like a million different lines, but the setup is the same one. So once you familiarize with the setup, you're going to recognize the patterns each time. So let's say what happens now. How can white defend this pawn? White has already lost the material advantage that he was trying to keep since the very beginning. So what does white have to do in order to not get completely crushed? Well, b3, for example, protects the pawn and allows the development of the bishop in an excellent diagonal. b3, and then black castles long, attack on the bishop. And so, well, unless white wants to pin his own pieces, white can just play a move like bishop e2, which is the best move by white. And now black continues development with knight f6. The development of the black player is excellent, and white needed to be more careful during the opening. The idea now is to play rook h to e8. So after a move like knight f3, for example, black simply takes this knight. Now it looks strange because we're not doubling up and isolating the pawn, but the reason why we're doing it is that we're exploiting a weak back rank. White hasn't developed these pieces because we were capturing pieces and white needed to recapture. Now we got a straight attack on this file, and after bishop takes f3, we're going to have an attack also on this file, especially with the protection of the bishop. So now white is risking what? Well, there's a threat now. Bishop c4 comes with a checkmate soon. So after rook h to e8, white plays the only move that seems to be making some sense, which is bishop e3, blocks the rook from checkmating, and also develops a piece. Black now goes on with knight g4 anyway. He's threatening to take away the bishop pair from the opponent. This bishop would not be able to be saved without black's attack to continue. Let's just remember that this bishop is stuck in e3 because of the threat of rook potentially reaching e1 after the bishop moves. And so after that, black will be able to give away the knight for the bishop pair, isolate an opponent's pawn, and infiltrate the piece as soon as possible. White will not even be able to develop these pieces. It's completely winning for black. Right, back at the starting position, e5, take, pawn up, right? So white takes, and then white is up a pawn. What happens after the more logical, let's say, well, queen takes d4. This is the one that happens the most. And then black takes back. Well, let's say white doesn't want to go through the same mess. There's all the sidelines we're going to be looking at through this video. And let's say white doesn't want to lose the right to castle, like it will probably happen. So after queen takes and knight takes, white tries to hold things together. So what's the threat here? The threat immediate is knight to c2, winning the rook. White knight to a3 to defend that square is not possible simply because of bishop takes knight, and then black is completely winning. It seems like white is going to give up the right to castle anyway, unless white plays bishop to d3, protecting the square, developing the bishop, and getting ready maybe knight e2 and then castle and so on. So after d3 now, after bishop to d3, black plays bishop to e6. The idea is to take this pawn in c4. Basically, that would be a free pawn because after bishop takes and bishop takes, then knight can go to c2 and do the exact same thing we were threatening one move ago. So what happens if white protects that pawn? How? Well, white can't really protect that pawn with the knight because of the same reason. So b3 protects the pawn for the moment and allows the development of the bishop in d2, and black goes on with the usual long castle, typical of the Chigorin defense. So what can white play now? Well, the best move is bishop g5. The reason is bishop b2 goes into trouble already. Black's development is superior, therefore tactics will appear. Right now there's attack development of the bishop there, is met by knight b3. There is no intermediate move, so white will either lose the rook or the bishop. Well, of course white will take the knight. Black now wins the bishop, so black has won a pawn basically, and he's got better development. Now this rook will be protected by the bishop in case of the attack king, and then white will also lose the right to castle, and black's development will arrive through knight to e7, potentially knight to c6 or knight to g6, depending on whether it makes sense to apply more pressure on e5 or not, if white will have enough defenders. So after this move, let's just go on a few moves. First of all, the position of the white player is about to fall apart. Black is threatening to win a pawn with an attack on the bishop and have an amazing position after bishop b4 check. So the only move now, well, knight c3 will lose the game to bishop b4. So the best move now suggested by the engine is bishop to c3. It just stops bishop b4 from happening. So now black plays knight to e7. The idea is to play knight to c6, and after knight, let's say black gets to play a few moves in a row, then knight to c6 will come, and then if black gets to play again, then bishop b4 will come. There's going to be a double attack on the bishop. Bishop takes and knight takes, and you figure out how to continue from here because it's going to be very easy. So of course after knight e7 it's white to move. What happens after, as we mentioned, let's say king e2, right, attacking the rook. In this pattern, the positive thing about this setup is that bishop to f5 will be protecting the rook and it cannot be attacked right away. So that rook is safe. We're gonna have enough time to defend it because white has no actual way to attack it anytime soon. So right, white wants to continue the development, let's say knight 3, and now black can play knight to g6. We are applying pressure to this pawn, but it's well defended for the moment. We're just developing the knight, and especially we're threatening a super strong knight to f4. Knight to f4 will go on to win the game easy. Knight to f4 will come with a fork. It's going to be attacking this pawn in g2. So let's say, for example, white plays rook to d1. That would be a huge blunder because of the knight check. The king goes back to f1. The rook is falling, and if the king goes back to e1, the knight g2 check, then black is winning a pawn again, king e2, knight f4 again, the king will move again, and then we've got plenty of other ideas. Even this would be very easy to play. Black's got the bishop pair and material advantage and a better position. So white's best move in this position is g3, stopping the knight from going to f4. So now black continues simply. Look at the harmony of the development of the black player. Every piece is developed. Bishop to c5 now, preparing to double up the rooks. And if white looks for a swap like rook to d1, also because there's just too much pressure. The white knight in b1 is unable to develop because the bishop fall. This rook is useless. So after rook to d1, then we simply take, king takes, we get the last rook into the game, rook d8 check. This pawn is about taken. The position of the white player is falling apart. After a move like king e2, for example, then bishop d3 check, and then where does the king hide? King e1 to still protect the pawn in f2. Maybe this just loses everything because the superior development of the black player. Look, white hasn't developed these two pieces. The superior development of the black player allows tactics. So bishop b1, for example, rook takes, and now this is a 4. Right, back at the starting position after e5, pawn takes, and then pawn up. Right, white goes and continues with the material advantage. Queen takes and knight takes, and the bishop defends the square c2. So how do we go on now? Bishop e6, immediately putting pressure on the c4 square. This is protected by b3. Now the white player knows that he can't develop the bishop to b2 without going through tactics. So after this move, b3, black will castle, and the best move for white is bishop to g5, attacking the rook. This is met by pawn to f6. Right, we want to get rid of this. We still want to go for that tactic, knight to b3, and then win material and get this excellent position. So after f6 now, white's best move is to take the pawn, and then we take back with the knight. right? So our development is excellent. We've only got 2 pieces left to develop, the bishop and the rook. This bishop might come in with a check. The other rook might come immediately on the same file of the opponent king. White is in trouble already. So it's white to move. Well, what does white need to do? White needs to develop the last knights and castle as soon as possible. At the same time, you always need to watch for this tactic, right? The knight b3. A move like knight to f3, for example, is just not possible because of knight takes with check, and then the rook is attacking the bishop. So this bishop is under huge pressure. So let's say white plays knight to e2, maybe the idea of castling soon. Then black will play bishop b4 check, and this is already big trouble because of the unbelievable pressure of the black player on this king. So let's say, for example, king f1, then knight b3 comes, right? That tactic is happening and black's position is superior. Let's say, well, king d1 is even worse. Same reason, you know, the bishop will be taken with check, or white will lose a lot of material. There's plenty of other ways to block. All of them fail. Knight to c3 is a way to block, but this loses because this knight is pinned. So black can just take the knight in e2, and then we will win this knight. Whatever white takes back with the king or with the bishop, we will still take the knight. We're winning a piece. If white blocks with this knight, then again, knight takes in e2. And what happens? Well, if bishop takes, right, we're putting pressure on this knight, we're pinning the knight. There's 2 attackers. We're going to put another attacker. And we don't worry about losing the exchange because we're just going to have just too much attack on this d2 knight. We're going to be winning. So after knight takes knight, what happens after king takes? Maybe the white king wants to open up the rooks and also gets to protect the king. After this move, then rook h2 e8. A lot of threats are happening now. This bishop is threatening to go to c4, probably win this bishop as well, discover check. The best move now, according to the engine, the only move that saves the white for the moment is, well, we don't have to worry about bishop takes f6, simply because we just take back. We still have the same threats happening. So after knight to e4, best move by white. Black continues with bishop g4 check. We're pinning this knight, we're attacking the king. What can the king do? Well, if the king moves away, then we will win a piece. If pawn to f3, then this is how to continue. Knight takes e4. And now what can white do? Well, taking the bishop here will lose this bishop here with check. So black has got too much more material and it will be winning the game very quickly. This pawn cannot take the knight because it's pinned. Well, this bishop can take the knight. But when that happens, then the rook can take the bishop for free. So what happens after bishop takes d8? Then simply knight g3, it's a double checks, check by the knight, check by the rook. The knight is taking the rook next, and black will be winning material soon. Let's just go back a few moves. Same position. After bishop g5, f6, pawn takes, knight takes, and now, as we mentioned, knight f3 is not possible because he loses a bishop. So after knight e2 and bishop b4 check, what happens after bishop goes back to d2? Well, this is my favorite because the game doesn't end necessarily immediately, but it goes on. But it's just like so favorable. It's so pleasant to play for black. Black goes on with the exact same move as we've always been going on in the previous examples. Knight takes pawn to e2. So after, okay, let's say bishop takes, then this is met by a beautiful variation. Rook takes bishop, and now white has to recapture the piece, so knight takes. But then we've got this knight coming, and after the rook is protecting further, then we'll attack even further, and we're winning material. Another variation is after knight takes, it could be that bishop takes bishop in b4. Well, in that case, we play knight to f4, attacking the bishop and attacking the g2 square rook that comes with the check. The knight will then go back to f4. Moves like rook h2 e8 is coming anyway. Black might potentially infiltrate the bishop to h3 in case the king tries to run away, and it's still such a dominant position. It just cannot be blocked. Like bishop to c2 is met by knight takes c2 with check, and black's position is falling apart. A move like bishop to f1, if white wants to potentially play g3 with an attack on the knight and maybe develop the bishop in fianchetto, then rook h2 e8. And it's just all sorts of discovered threats. That's a terrible position to play for white. I think right now the engine evaluates the position like something like -8. So that's going to be enough for this line. Back at the starting position after e5, and pawn takes, and d4. Pawn takes again. Of course, we take back with the queen. We are more than happy to trade queens, even though we're down in material, because of all the threats that we've seen in the previous lines. So what happens after a move like, let's just mention a very quick mistake here. Bishop e3 is a horrible mistake. You may think that this is a poison pawn, but it's really not. Queen b2 is met by the only move. Well, bishop d4 is not possible to attack the rook because we have 2 attackers. We got the knight and the queen in d4, so bishop d4 is not possible. You might think white can just play knight to d2, develop the pieces, and then attack the queen, and then black will be backwards in development and white might try and attack, so maybe sacrifice a poison pawn. How to continue this? Well, black plays knight to b4. It's already threatening knight to c2, winning the rook. And so how does white stop this? Well, rook b1, for example, attacking the queen is met by knight to c2. The queen cannot take the knight because of the queen. And after the only move, king to e2, black goes on to take this pawn. So now black's material advantage is growing, although you might think, okay, well, white's development is going to be fine. Well, the problem is that the king in e2 is blocking the bishop from development, and now white's idea of giving up these pawns for the sake of development is failing. This king is not even going to castle. So after a move like rook to c1, doubling the attack on the knight, black just continue with the harmonious and always favorite bishop f5. So what's the best move now? The best move according to the engine is g4. Of course, he attacks the bishop immediately and allows the development of the bishop next. But that's simply after bishop g6. Now again, best move is f4, 5 with bishop. Black plays knight to e3, and black is too much material ahead. So going back a few moves, knight to b4 is threatening knight to c2. What happens after rook to c1, protecting the c2 square? Then again, bishop to f5. This is the usual development of the black player. I love this bishop going to f5 every time. And now white needs to develop the pieces. What are we threatening? We're threatening knight c2. Same messing up of the opponent king. And the funny thing is that this is actually unstoppable. As a matter of fact, the earlier move g4 was actually brilliant, but it didn't really stop the thing because of bishop g6. So knight c2 is happening anyway. So if white were to play another move like knight to f3, then again knight to c2, king e2. Now in this case we will play long castle with the threat of bishop d3. Good luck to white stopping this. And no, the moves will be possible. Knight d4, it just gets taken, and so it's just going to be a nightmare. The e1 square is attacked by the knight, and white will have to give up the exchange. If white doesn't play knight to f3 but rather plays bishop to e2, maybe getting the king to a potential square available, well, that also loses, and really bad as well, because knight to c2, again, white will have to surrender the exchange. After this move, if white's idea was bishop e2 in order to get a shelter for the king, then king f1 is met by knight to e3. So now there's a check, there's an attack on the queen, the only move is pawn takes back, and now black castles and applying pressure here. Rook and queen threatening to take the knight. The rook will not be able to protect because of our amazingly placed bishop in f5. What happens after knight f3? Defending the knight, bishop e4. All of these moves, every video you have seen so far of the Chigorin defense that I've uploaded in my channel, you must have seen always the same moves. How nicely these bishops are developed, how this long castle always comes with an attack on the queen. The queen's gambit is there to be punished, and the Chigorin defense is the best weapon to do it.